Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here is your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you nearly live. We're in Ottawa, Ontario, at the University of Ottawa, in the History Department, in our new building. This is about the 1-year anniversary since we moved, and we're looking out east-facing view here, where on Friday of this week, Pride Week starts here in Ottawa, and I realize that there's Pride Weeks across the country, but you know what? I'm based in Ottawa, so we're going to do this with the Ottawa Pride Week. And here with us to talk a little bit about Pride Week and her book, Not in This Family, Gays and the Meaning of Kinship in Post-War North America, Heather Murray from the University of Ottawa. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Sean. Thank you.
Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So we were just talking a little bit about the book and you know some of the different issues that you bring up, and it's really, I think it's a really interesting study and something that changes the historiography of gays in North America. But I'm wondering, because you talk so much about family, to start off methodologically, you know, how do you go about putting together this sort of book? Because this is a very private experience, relationships within families, and it can be a difficult thing to really probe and really understand. So how do you go about putting together this type of study?
I don't know if it was that difficult to probe, just because most archival collections have personal correspondence between parents and children. So it seemed like a sort of natural body of sources to gravitate towards. And, I mean, one of the things with gay research is that there are quite a few repositories that are specifically gay and lesbian based or specifically sexuality based. So you know you're going to find some, quote, sexual minorities there, right, to use. So in that sense, things were quite concentrated in New York City, in San Francisco, Chicago, places where you would, you know, major urban areas where you might expect to find gay populations. So that part was actually, I don't want to say it was easy, because there were certain, well, I shouldn't say it was easy ever, but there are certain challenges to working with community archives that aren't affiliated with a university, for example, like where you're kind of negotiating time for 2 hours a week, or can you stay there? Like at the Lesbian Her Story Archives in Brooklyn, I was actually allowed to stay there because it's in a house. So that was kind of convenient, but also a bit weird. So, yeah.
Staying at the archive would, that
was strange.
Yeah.
That was really weird, actually. Yeah, and I did a bus tour once. They wanted me to conduct a tour of these lesbians who were visiting from a bus. So they just came in and I showed them the archives, and then they left. And
wow.
Yeah, that was kind of funny.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so, I mean, there are certain archives like that that are very much community-based, and you know, sometimes they don't have the physical capacity that a, quote, real archive does. So in San Francisco, I actually tripped over this woman's computer cord, her laptop cord, and broke her laptop, which was, very bad. Yeah. I mean, we're getting into real practical aspects of archival research now, but that wasn't good.
But because it's interesting to me in that you're looking at a very specific element of a person's life.
Yeah.
And so even if there's a collection of a person who is gay, you can go look at their stuff. There might not be any mention of their family or their personal life at all. Yeah. So it strikes me as a topic that you could go down a lot of roads with nothing at the end of it. Oh, yeah,
definitely. And there are all kinds of examples like that where you're just kind of analyzing absence, basically. I mean, not to sound too existential or whatever, the presence of absence, but like, what does that mean that they're never actually mentioning this? And it seems an open secret. It seems like the parents know, but all they're talking about is what they watched for what they watched on TV, or what they had for dinner, or just these sort of, seemingly quotidian things. So, that's kind of a problem. And it kind of makes you realize how you kind of rig the decks when you're an historian, that you're really telling the story of people who did leave a story and who found this worthy of talking about. But what about all these people who just never mentioned it? Does that mean they're intensely private, or does that mean it just didn't matter to them, or they felt it was something they could not talk about, or
And then within that context, though, did you do any interviews with people, maybe older folks whose parents have passed on, or did you even do maybe interviews with families?
No,
who have gay kids?
And I think that's one of the criticisms of the book is, where's the oral history that's sort of been a pillar of gay history and social history.
Yeah.
I mean, I think gay history and social history have kind of maybe grown up together, and this kind of cast it as a cultural history or an intellectual history. I guess I saw this as being about the representations. So after I was doing the sort of intimate correspondence, then I wanted to see how those intimate emotions or interactions projected more broadly into gay culture or projected into gay politics, like how the family actually became a part of gay politics or how the family became part of the representational stuff that gays produced. So I think I was more interested in those representational aspects than in kind of a real story. I mean, to the extent that oral history is real. Yeah. So I don't know. I guess I could have done that as well. It would have been a very long book, though. Yeah.
There's limitations as to how much you can include. And I
felt it had been done before in gay history, that like almost every gay history is an oral history of a community. So I thought, well, let's kind of look at private life and maybe try it from a different lens.
Okay.
I wasn't trying to assert some sort of superiority of cultural history or something like that. I just wanted to try something a bit different, and probably the professors I had who supervised this were, I wouldn't say hostile to oral history, but just maybe not as interested in it as a methodology.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Now, you've used the word family a few times, and the word family appears in the title of the book, but that doesn't really have, a concrete set meaning, the word family.
Yeah.
So for you, how do you define family, and how are you trying to approach that concept in this work?
Yeah, I don't know if I've got a good definition for family or sort of a profound statement about that. I was interested in how family relationships evolve, though. I mean, I was very interested in Robert Orsi, who's an historian of immigrant families. At the time I was reading this, I was reading him. At the time I was writing this, rather, I was reading him. And I really liked what he had to say about the family as a theater of self-revelation. Like, that was his phrase that I really, really took up in this book, because I thought, wow, the family is really purposeless after World War II, after the social dislocations of the Depression and World War II. There's no point in it. I mean, there is a point, but I mean, what practical function does it serve? What economic function does it serve? It's just purely an emotional function, and that just burdens the family unit so much.
Right.
So I was very interested in how, in his idea of the family as a theater of self-revelation, and how that intertwines with a broader repeal of reticence, to use Rochelle Gerstein's phrase, or the broader demise of discretion, or whatever you want to call it, like the end of privacy in self-revelation. Does the family as a theater for revelation encourage a kind of broader self-revelation in society? So I think that's what I was trying to intertwine in the book. And I think most people see it as being strictly about privacy, and they sort of forget that family part. So it's really nice that you brought up the family.
But that speaks to then this notion of kinship, and you can have a relationship with somebody that is like a familial relationship, but there's no blood relation there. And then, so, in tackling the idea of the family, a lot of this book, and I think a lot of what you're trying to get at too, is very much a parent-child relationship. But at the same time, there is this awareness of not just siblings, but extended cousins, or even close friends who have that type of relationship. So it's one of those issues that's really hard to define, and I realize that there's been theses written on what constitutes family, and it's a huge issue. But when you're talking about these kinship relationships within or just family relationships in general, how do they change once there is the introduction of homosexuality? I
think gay historiography has been quite interested in this idea of families we choose, to use Kath Weston's phrase. who's an anthropologist. She talked about gays either been rejected by their biological families or just not fitting in with them and having to form alternative kinship networks. And I think some people read this, well mine, as saying that, she disagrees profoundly with Kath Weston, she's trying to challenge her. And that's not really true. I just want to explore how enmeshed people remain in that biological family, even when they claim they have rejected it or that there has been a rejection, which was sometimes the case. And then how those two families function together, the biological ones and those kinds of really close peer communities.
Yeah, because in the book you talk about how the historiography has kind of framed it as gays as orphans. That once somebody comes out, they lose that biological family relationship.
Yeah.
And you're trying to counter this and say, no, these relationships still do exist. Even if they're negative, they still do exist and they still have an impact.
And they exist at the level of consciousness, which translates into cultural forms or politics or something. So, no, I think that's exactly what I was hoping to convey. And the idea of orphanhood, I think, is, as a symbol now, we're not talking literal, but is more profound than just gays and their parents. It's kind of a part of being in a nuclear family in the post-war period in the Western world, in a sense, is that feeling that you are by yourself, that you don't have those extended family networks that used to bolster the family, or those community networks that used to bolster the family. You're kind of orphaned. And what does that mean to be an orphan, I guess?
So you mentioned this, the changing notion of family then in the post-World War II period, and you acknowledge in the book that the temporal framework for books can generally be very arbitrary. But so why did you pick the end of the Second World War as your starting point? Because you say that there's a clear or there's a definable shift in family relationships after the Second World War. So what is that shift, and how does it mark itself from the pre-World War II period?
I would say that shift it's almost a kind of formlessness. It's like, what do we do now? What are we now? What is our identity now? Even in a moment when the nuclear family is so celebrated in consumer culture, in political culture in the United States, how do you deal with that? How do you meet that expectation for intimacy? These kinds of introspective questions. I mean, I'm sure people pose them in other eras too, but I think there's more impetus to pose them in this era, rather. Yeah.
And you also have the added dimension, and you talk about this too, that there are people who have been in Europe fighting in the United States case since 1941.
Yeah.
And now they're coming back. So there's this reintroduction of a person who's been gone for a long time. And and I talked about this when I taught about the Second World War and the cultural side of it, is that people are coming home, but they're not coming home to the place that they left. And there's a transition and having to sort of reacclimatize to what's going on, because at home you have these new routines and you've managed to fill in for this person while they're gone. So now that all these people are coming back from the front, there's already this changing dynamic of what is a family and how does everybody fit in. And then you throw in this added dimension, and we'll talk about this, of an emerging gay community post-World War II, and that adds further dimension to it. And it's really like almost like the family is undergoing a bit of a crisis, or the idea of a family is undergoing a crisis in this period. And then you see like Leave It to Beaver trying to renew that idea of what a family can be. So let's get into this idea then of the introduction of a gay community into these dynamics. Now, you say in the book that a definable or a tangible gay community doesn't really emerge until after the Second World War. Despite
and
the
even
fact,
then, I think it's quite underground when you're looking at the 50s, for example, even the early 60s. I don't think you're seeing it more visible until the late 60s,
right?
When it's sort of attached to other social movements.
But what is that community then in the immediate post-war period? Is it, even if it is hidden and underground, it's still emerging to a degree, and how is that movement coming about, and how are these people relating to each other and then relating back to their families.
I think these kinds of organizations are small. They're in urban centers, in areas of not necessarily overt activism, but areas where people can meet other gay people and talk about that a little bit. But I don't know how many people had heard of it. I mean, things like Mattachine Society, Daughters of Bilitis, I mean, I think their membership was like 5,000 people. So they're pretty marginal. And, I mean, I think one thing you have in the 50s is gays emerging as deviants in popular culture or political culture, in Kinsey or in McCarthyism or something. And that projects gays into the public imagination a little bit more. So I think people hear about it in these kind of deviant contexts. And maybe follow up by reading some sexology or something like that. I mean, the kinds of people I'm dealing with in this book were people very much like that. Like, oh, I'm going to go read this Kinsey, or I'm going to go read Havelock Ellis and find out about myself, because most of them were intellectuals. So I think we're looking at people's personal intellectual trajectories too. Yeah.
But if let's say it's 1955, and I'm one of these people, and then I'm joining this community, and I'm reading this stuff, and then I go home, and I say to my parents, I'm gay. How is that, in general, how is that going to be received? Because the parents wouldn't be familiar with the community. Their only association with homosexuality would be these negative connotations in popular culture. So how does that dynamic start to play out in the 1950s?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it does. I think that's the interesting part, is that people reveal their gayness, if you want to call it that, in codes, in a sense, right? That first soldier in the book says, I am strongly attracted to people of my own sex. I mean, he says it the most overtly of probably anyone I know. Others seem to really embrace discretion as a strategy and say, Bill, my good longtime friend, is now living with me permanently, things like this, so that you get the clue, but you don't necessarily speak it. I guess one of the things that surprised me is how workable that was for a lot of people, that they really rejected this business of coming out and gay pride and all this kind of stuff by the 60s and 70s. Or they thought the pressure to talk about it was just too immense, and that it worked in the way that they were doing it. But I think some people felt the toll of that after a time. Like, they had a kind of secrecy fatigue, that they really felt they were living double lives. I mean, I was really interested when I was doing this at how, I wouldn't call them that they were lying, but they did, play with the truth a little bit about their sexuality, and it sort of, for some people, blobbed out into other parts of their lives, that then they would start pretending that they, had a different class background, or that they had just had this great trip to Europe, and things like that often were sort of keyed in with class, which I find very interesting. There's something about that must have been quite difficult. But it must have been exciting, too. I mean, I think there were some people that said, back when we spoke in code, there was something really intimate. Like, it heightened the intimacy of gay relationships, because no one else knew about it except for us. And it was this kind of secret society. And now everyone knows, and it's just, the story's blown, It's all out in the open now. And a lot of people rejected that, which is interesting.
Yeah, so it's almost like the Liberace model of no one's hiding anything, but no one's saying anything either.
Yeah.
And it's...
Did you see that movie?
The Liberace? No, not the new one. No, I read a review, and the reviewer said that some of the scenes were a little too intense for them. And
really?
Yeah. And so
what
I haven't
kind of
seen
scenes?
It. The love scenes.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my God. There's hardly any love scenes.
Really?
No.
So
I was surprised, given all I had read about it too.
Yeah.
But no.
It wasn't as bad as because they said it was like 20 minutes of just this, and like
what? No.
And
in fact, they should have probably had more. I mean,
oh, really?
No, there was hardly anything. I was very surprised, because there had been all those interviews like, "Oh my God, how did you manage to make out with Matt Damon?" Blah blah blah. So, but that movie's interesting because the one is from a younger generation, and he's kind of older, and he's that model that I'm talking about. Discreet, but also, when does discretion become a lie? When does a lie by omission become a lie? Yeah. I think that movie is very good at dealing with those. It's very Goffman-esque.
So then, as this community, and you've alluded to it, sort of this underground, unspoken thing, people, like you say, some people start to get fed up with this. Late 60s, early 70s, and this
I think it's a new generation. I don't think it's necessarily that generation.
Right. But could it be part then, too, of this 60s, 70s generation that's rejecting their parents' values? Mm-hmm. And there's this widespread thing of younger people are saying, this is how we're going to do things.
Yeah.
And for the gay community, these people who are coming of age, late 60s, early 70s, are saying the same thing. We're not going to do it your way. Mm-hmm. We're going to do it our own way. And it becomes much more of a public thing.
Yeah, and I think that's intertwined with other social movements like feminism and movements that have as one of their bases, I mean, not everyone calls it coming out, but there is a kind of confessional in feminism, right? There's consciousness raising, like, this happened to me and this happened to me, and then you convert that to a more political consciousness. And so I think feminism and gay liberation are really intertwined. But also, I don't just relate it to other social movements, but to movements in the arts in this period. Like, I talk about the new journalism in the book, or, the trend towards first-person writing and more confessionals in fiction, the kind of blurry lines between fiction and autobiography, memoir culture, this kind of thing. How heterosexual life stories are starting to be more prevalent. And I think gays are using that as a model as well to tell confessionals and tell the life story. And I think that's part of the political movement, which some of the older generation of gays thought was distasteful, basically.
Within that context, and you mentioned feminism, you talk about how a definable lesbian group then starts to emerge.
Yeah.
To differentiate itself from
gay liberationists.
Yeah, which they associate with primarily male.
And male sort of sexual concerns. And there's definitely an effort to define lesbianism in more purely emotional terms and kind of move away from that hypersexualized portrait. I mean, at least among some lesbian feminists in the 1970s. Then in the 80s, we get the kind of lesbian sex wars, and people want to change that perception of lesbianism as, just sitting around drinking herbal tea and cuddling or whatever. But I think definitely you see that in the 70s. And I found the 1970s lesbian feminists really interesting to think about and read their correspondence with their mothers, because it was so mother-focused. And their mothers are very, very obsessed with physical appearance.
Really?
This is one area where I thought, if lesbians in this era had been stereotyped as beautiful, I'm not sure any of these mothers would have really cared about it. I know that sounds reductive, but these mothers were obsessed with physical appearance. It's kind of depressing.
Yeah.
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 I mean, I think they felt that the parents of the baby boom felt that the only way to have a chance at a husband or a sexual relationship was to be really good looking. And if you were kind of rejecting conventional femininity, then your life was going to be terrible and sad, and you'd be alone. But the squabbles tended to be about physical appearance rather than sexuality for lesbians. And to a certain extent, I think that was the case for gay men. But I also think the sexuality was very alarming as well for some parents. But with lesbians, there's definitely more a trend towards physical appearance. And I think that was one of the criticisms I received of the book, was that I should have talked more about physical, bodies and people as physical beings and stuff like that, which I think is a good criticism. I should have done that.
But then I find this interesting then, that this relationship between the mothers and the daughters, and if there's a similar relationship between fathers and sons, or what's the relationship then between mother and son, or father and daughter, and how does the introduction of the homosexuality change what would traditionally be conceptualized as those relationships? Because generally, the father-son relationship is thought of as this very, you teach your son how to be a man, and you teach him all these things, and then when he becomes a father, you teach him how to be a father. And the introduction of a gay son in this dynamic changes a lot of that, or at least maybe changes the perception of that. And even today, you see, I saw where Oprah interviewed Neil Patrick Harris and David Burka, and they interviewed the two fathers, and the two fathers admitted that when the sons came out to them, they were initially a little disappointed, because of what their conception of a father-son relationship should be, and the things that as a father they should or would be able to teach their sons, and some of that was now taken away from them.
Yeah.
And they admitted that that was a short-term thing, but it took some getting used to. So, this idea of traditional parental relationships and how it changes, I'm curious as to see how parents would react, and if there's this notion of disappointment, and how, as it starts to emerge in the 60s and 70s, how that starts to be reflected in these relationships, especially in a time when older generations are being rejected by younger generations just generally in American culture. So how is this further that?
Which in some sense eases the coming out moment in a weird way, because sometimes gayness gets written off as rebellion. Like, oh, well, this is just part of you being a hippie.
Right.
This is just part of you being part of that stupid baby boomer generation who's so self-absorbed and, affected. And you'll come out of this in a few years anyway, so to speak. So in some senses, the gayness almost gets lost in that sort of larger rebellion, which I don't know if that facilitated things, but it definitely gives it a different dynamic than, say, coming out in the 80s and 90s. Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about the book is that the mothers were often the family communicators. So in the family correspondence of these gay writers or artists, whoever they were that I looked at, mostly they talked to the mothers. They didn't have a huge amount of correspondence with fathers. Occasionally, you'll see a father writing to his lesbian daughter saying, I feel displaced and all I care about is ladies nowadays and things like this. So occasionally you see that feeling of displacement, like you talk about with Neil Patrick Harrison, the other guy, and like they have no role and that you're strangers to like strangers within your own family.
Right.
How do you deal with that alienation?
Well, that sort of brings up the issue then of PFLAG, and as we get into the 1980s.
Yeah.
And so PFLAG, it's, what is it, parents, I don't even know what it stands for, to be honest with you.
Parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays.
Okay.
Sometimes friends goes first, and then families is second. So that's changed a little bit over time, the acronym. But yeah, parents, families, and friends of lesbians and gays.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this organization starts to spread out really in the 1980s.
Yeah.
And I'm curious to ask, who does it really serve? Is it there to help parents, or is it there to help the kids? Who's really benefiting from this organization? Because I could see how people would say that, well, it's for the parents, and a way for parents to, have a group or a community amongst themselves of people who have gay kids, and how everyone has dealt with it. Or different circumstances, or maybe neighbors who are now upset with them and they feel that they've failed as parents, and how they respond to those sorts of situations. And because the discrimination that the gay community has felt, the parents of the gay community would have also gotten some of that same discrimination. So I could see how people would view it as that, but I could also see it for the kids. For them, it's a way to introduce their parents to this community, and to sort of get them to know them, like you say, this stranger idea. Yeah. And I could see that being a benefit for the kids, too. So I'm just wondering, with this organization, I mean, what's really the purpose of it, and who is it serving?
Well, I would definitely say it's for the parents. I think it was conceived for parents and sort of remains that way, although from what I've been hearing about PFLAG recently is that it's been having a little bit of a little existential crisis, I guess, because they're not getting as many people using it in a lot of urban areas. Oh. And they're having kind of a outgrowth, I guess, in more rural areas, but not as many people are using it, which maybe is good. Maybe people are less upset now if their kid comes out to them. Right. Although I would think kids are coming out a lot younger now. Yeah. So I don't know. So I think that's really interesting. But what I noticed when I was doing my research on PFLAG is a definite shift in the tenor of their activism. I think in the 70s, they definitely kind of embraced a gay liberation model, very unapologetic about their kids' sexual orientations, and open about gay sexuality in a way that the 80s and 90s activists of PFLAG, the parents, really moved away from, because they wanted to embrace the strategy of respectability. And for obvious reasons. I mean, I think they felt quite besieged by the new right in the United States. So they felt they really had to stress their respectability, their their middle classness, in some cases their whiteness, which I actually think is changing, to be fair. But yeah, I think the organization changes quite profoundly and moves away from that earlier radical model and starts to be kind of more of a proper organization.
But the rise of this organization kind of speaks at the same time to the notion of gays as an ethnic group.
Yeah.
Because generally speaking, these sorts of activist organizations have been for ethnic groups, with, I guess, the obvious exception of the women's movement. But even that, it's depending on how you want to define ethnicity, it could be...
Well, and even that models itself after the black movement as well, black civil rights.
Mm-hmm. So within that context, then, you have these parents who are involved and this emergence of lesbians in the 70s and then this gay liberation movement and all this. Mm-hmm. This idea of gays as an ethnic group, how does that manifest itself?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think before the idea of the gay minority as an ethnic group, notions of gays are dominated by being a sickness or having a kind of tortured soul. So we go from a psychological model to an ethnic model. And what I find interesting about some queer theory, or whatever you want to call it nowadays, is that kind of embrace of gay shame. That sort of, to say that there is something very interesting about that tortured soul model, because it permits so many different kind of feelings, whereas the ethnicity model really just permits that one emotion, and that's pride. So I find some of that stuff pretty interesting right now. And I think the other way it manifests itself, especially in the PFLAG documents, is that gayness is an ethnicity which precludes non-white gays, which I find very interesting. Like all the pictures from the 80s that you see in PFLAG or the promotional materials displays white families. Okay. And you read the testimonies of some non-white gays who say, well, I didn't think I could try to go to PFLAG because that seemed to be for white people, white Westerners. It just, as a young Asian lesbian or whatever, I didn't feel like I could join that organization. So that's kind of interesting. And you get that rhetoric of being gay, it's just like being black. These kinds of equivalences that almost kind of preclude non-white gays from entry into this kind of conceptual framework. Yeah, which I find very interesting. But I think PFLAG has taken steps now to address that and to try and be more all-encompassing for non-white gays as well. So
now this emergence then of this ethnic group and through the 70s, it really comes head on then with the emergence of Reagan conservatism in the 1980s. And
or even in the 70s. I think there's definitely a kind of Christian right, new right voice that is using gays as a symbol of undesirable social change.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that, and you can see...
But you're definitely right, it accelerates.
Right.
In the
well,
80s,
but even like the backlash to disco, right? And a lot of people say that it's a backlash to homosexuality and the rise of this movement. Yeah. And then you have Stonewall and all these other things, and things sort of figuratively blow up. But then you have this clash of this conservatism that really comes in and is really strong again. And it's compounded by the AIDS crisis in the 80s. And this strikes me as an interesting dynamic because as baby boomers who are now parents, who may have kids who are coming out and all this, so they grow up in this very progressive period and may have been part of the hippie movement and all this other things. And now they're middle class in the suburbs, probably voting for Reagan. And then they have a gay son, and they're reading in the news about AIDS and all this stuff, and it strikes me that this is a real clash of culture and something that could really upset a family dynamic. So how do these issues start to play out then in the 80s?
I think I'm still dealing with the baby boom generation as the gay kid, even when I'm talking about AIDS, because it's such a huge cohort. If we accept that it's to 1964 or something like that. A lot of the gay sons who were dying of AIDS were born in the 50s and 60s, so they're still baby boom kids. so it's still the parents of the baby boom who's dealing with this. And yeah, I actually argue in that chapter on AIDS, something that I also got pretty criticized for, is almost a kind of reconciliation there, because parents know what this is, right? They know what disease and death is. It kind of it renews parenting with a kind of horrific twist, I guess, but it renews parenting in a way that some people embraced, even despite having once rejected their... I mean, there's obviously families who never reconciled of any sort. And I don't even know if I would call it reconciliation, but there was some understanding. It just forces a kind of parallel between the social worlds of heterosexuals and homosexuals that maybe couldn't meet before, couldn't really understand before, but it just puts this universality of experience in death, unfortunately. Like, it would be better if they could find common ground without that.
But at the same time, like this notion of we have to return to traditional families and what that means. And is that construed then as an attack on the gay community?
Oh, yeah.
And with families, is there, do you find that there's an increased maybe rejection of gay children, or there's increased tension within the family dynamic as the ebb and flow of American society starts to go back towards conservatism?
I find there's a renewal of the biological model of gayness, because now there is quite literally a disease to deal with. I don't know if that made things more fraught, that the new right or the Christian right made things more fraught in the family. I think kids growing up in that period were definitely less confrontational than maybe their older baby boom peers of the 60s and 70s. And yet it was out of the bottle by that period. It was so talked about in that period, in the 80s, and especially in the gay 90s. I mean, all of these things, even negative publicity, projects it into the public imagination. Right. So I have to think that might ease the transition a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, that idea of renewing a traditional notion of what a parent is and this protective idea, it is interesting. And I would assume that Magic Johnson, I realize this is in the 90s, but when Magic Johnson reveals that he has HIV, that would probably be a changing point for this too, in this idea of it's not a gay disease. Maybe it's more prevalent in the gay community, but it's not a gay disease. And that, again, would change the dynamic of what AIDS is and how it relates to having gay children.
But he has a gay son now, too.
Yes, he does.
So that's very interesting.
Yeah. But within that context, too, the AIDS situation would be more for sons, right, than it would be for lesbian daughters. And the relationship then would change, and it again speaks to this idea of lesbians emerging as a different group or a minority group within a minority group and having to change or challenge different dynamics and understand various points of view. So I guess it speaks to this idea that you can't treat anyone, but you can't treat anyone as a homogenous group. And there's different dynamics at play. So one issue that you talk about extensively, and it's not just in this book, but generally within gay history, is the idea of the private as public. And generally speaking, sexual orientation would be a private thing, but with gay history or just generally with the gay rights movement, it's a private thing that's pulled into a public domain. And I'm conflicted on this because
why are you conflicted?
In one sense, I think that sexual orientation is not interesting. A person's sexual orientation, it shouldn't be the number one marker of who they are as a person.
Right.
Because the gender of the person who you have sex with, I don't understand why it's so interesting. It strikes me as this very voyeuristic thing and sort of this notion for scandal that we have. And not that being gay is scandalous, but if a politician has an affair with a woman even, or whatever, right? Or a heterosexual affair, that's part of this idea of so scandal, and it's interesting, and we want to know about these gritty details about people's lives, and that's what it strikes me as. And things like, so when the gay movement, it seems to me that they're setting themselves up as, your sexual orientation is the number one thing that's interesting about you. But at the same time, heterosexual couples who have a wedding, that is a public display of their sexual orientation.
Yeah.
And it doesn't appear as such. It's just a wedding. And it's not a big deal. So for me, it's like, how can this normal activity of a wedding, which is a display of sexual orientation, doesn't get any mention, yet a parade, a gay pride parade, why do I think of that as people setting themselves up as sexual orientation is number one thing? So to me, there's a gap there that I can't figure out.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm conflicted.
I think we have to remember that when gay libers started to declare the necessity of coming out, I mean, it really was a coherent political position. The personal is political. I mean, for feminists too. I mean, it's not just solipsism or narcissism. It is a coherent political point of view. There's something about self-authority that is quite subversive for them. So, I mean, I don't know if they were just trying to be exhibitionistic or something like that. But I do think that political position not deteriorates, but maybe withers away a little bit over time. And you start to see maybe, well, I called it in the book, a shift from the personal is political to the personal is public, to revelation for the sake of revelation. And I don't think that's unique to gays. I think that's part of the self-revelatory culture that we have that seems to be accelerating all around us, that people complain and throw their hands up about all the time, like generation of narcissists on Faceplace or Facebook. My mom calls it Faceplace. But like generation of solipsists, people taking pictures of themselves, all this kind of stuff. I mean, to me, that's not the same as looking to the self and telling the self story for a political purpose. And the amount of alienation these people felt growing up gay in earlier post-war moments. I think that's something that is hard to relate to. A young friend of mine who I used to babysit, he was telling me that this lesbian singer came to his high school, and he thought that she was really kind of ramming the gay rights message down his throat. And he was a little bit put off by it, and he said, well, you know, my generation has grown up on Glee. I think he's 15 years old. Okay. My generation has grown up on Glee. We all have gay friends. I mean, all my girlfriends identify, like his friends that are girls, identify themselves as bisexuals, and, you know, we're fine with this. I mean, it's almost a cliche that sexuality is fluid and that you can be gay. I mean, it doesn't matter. So he kind of forgets how freighted the identity was, I think, in earlier post-war moments. But I mean, that goes in the other direction too, because there's an older generation of gays who do find that kind of self-revelation very off-putting as well. So, no, but I absolutely agree that heterosexual weddings can feel like heterosexual pride, but they're muted by the social institution of marriage. Right. So maybe now that there's gay marriage, that will mute the kind of, whatever you want to call it, the kind of in-your-facedness or whatever people call it of gay pride. Or and I think that's a worry of people who are against gay marriage. Is that it's going to dilute the radicalism of the movement, and that this in-your-facedness is necessary, that this exhibitionistic quality is necessary. But no, this is something that really interests me, is the public and private, and the privatization of public space, and what actually is public space. I mean, like, Zizek had a really interesting article in the New Statesman a little while ago where he said, this is not exhibitionism, people going on Instagram or whatever all these sites are, Facebook and stuff. This is not exhibitionism, because that's not public space. The internet is not public space. If you're going to be an exhibitionist, you have to go out in the streets and kind of force yourself into public space. And this is what we're not doing anymore. So he thought the internet was still private space, which I find very interesting. Yeah.
Well, and I guess the other thing that you have to acknowledge is that gay kids are committing suicide at a rate that is disproportionate to the rest of the population, or at least the rest of the teenage population. So if that's part of, you know, this in-your-facedness, is to reach to that kid in rural wherever who has no one to talk to and say that, okay, it is okay and there are other people like you, then obviously that's a worthwhile goal. But I think the end game should be that when that kid is like, hey, I'm gay, then it's like, okay. Like, so what? Like, it's like when Jason Collins came out a few months ago, part of me was disappointed that it was such a big story, because it should just be okay. Like I said, like gay men have played basketball since basketball was invented. So the fact that now there's one in the NBA, like he's not the first gay man to ever play in the NBA. He's the first one to
say he
come
does.
out while he was
Yeah.
playing, but so what, right? And then the added dynamic, as we were talking about before, that people were like, well, he's a tough guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like being gay doesn't mean that you can't be tough.
Yeah.
And so like it's sort of these issues that are still at play, and there still needs to be some sort of resolution. And I know it's cliche to say, but if we can get to the point where coming out isn't a big deal, then I think that we'll all be better off, because I think that'd be a sign that it's more that as a society it's more accepted, and that everything is, or that everyone can sort of appreciate everyone else for who they are.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be as contentious as there seems to be some sort of contention right now.
One of the things the older generation of gays would say is that privacy would be a useful strategy. Like, oh, look at all those gay suicides. Well, if we reinstituted the kind of private model, the discrete model, there wouldn't be those suicides. It just wouldn't be on the table for discussion. But I'm not sure that you can revive a privacy model the way the world is now, even the way the world is in 1969, 1968, 69. I think once it's out of the bottle, it's tough. I mean, I imagine that's tough for young gay people, and I mean young. I don't mean college age, but 13, 14-year-olds. If there is an expectation to come out even earlier, I imagine that's quite tough for a child to deal with. I mean, I didn't talk about children in my book. I mean, I talked about recollections of children, but I was mostly talking about gay adults.
Yeah.
So I think it'd be nice to have more work on gay children. And I think there's definitely historians and literary types who are working on the tomboy figure and the Queenie boy and stuff like that.
Right.
And I mean, they're looking at it mostly through cultural representations, but it'd be nice to have more work on gay youth.
It was a female basketball player, and again, this thing of
I think I know who that is. Brittany
Griner.
Yeah. The one who dunks. Yeah.
So like her whole situation is like, it's not as big of for some reason it's not as big of a deal for, in that context, for a female basketball player to come out versus the male basketball player, because in the male situation, all these jock guys are talking about, well, what's it going to be like in the locker room?
Yeah. But maybe it would be a big deal.
It's the same thing. It's just a different gender in the women's locker room. But I remember, I think it was her. She told a story of how she came out to her parents. It was either her or another. It was definitely a female basketball player. Yeah. Who, she came home one night and she had a hickey, and her mother said, "What guy did that?" And she just said it wasn't a guy.
That was a good opportunity.
Yeah, and that's sort of how it happened. And everyone was sort of, and she was like, "Oh, okay," and she was cool with it. And it struck me as like that's an interesting way to go about it. I mean, I realize it's forced out of you in that situation because there's this physical marker of something that happened. So, but the reaction of the parent in that situation and the reaction of the girl in that situation is something that's interesting to me, is that it's just like, oh, this is what it is. Yeah. And let's move on.
Yeah. I mean, if people all had parents who were laissez-faire like that, I mean, and I wonder if it would be a bigger deal if a lesbian came out in a different context. Like if a lesbian came out on, I was going to say The Bachelorette, but that doesn't make any sense. Like, but something, something where it was expected that it was this highly feminine woman, because I've read lesbian scientists and sports figures. People don't think that's weird if they're lesbian in that context. They're like, oh, no wonder you can do science, and no wonder you're so good at sports. No wonder you can dunk like that. You're a lesbian. So maybe if it was in another context, it would be different. Yeah.
Well, I mean, like when Ellen came out. Yeah. Right? I mean, the reaction to that was, she says, it's interesting to listen to her talk about it now, and that, I mean, her show got canceled, and she was basically just exiled from the entertainment industry for a while, and then she comes back, and she's completely accepted, and now she's the top talk show host in the industry. But that initial reaction was very negative to her. But I don't know if anyone would have ever characterized her as ultra feminine. No. But now,
and she had an interesting strategy, because she had done a lot of coded things before she actually did that Time magazine cover that left no doubt. But I mean, there were a lot of coded kind of moments in her show or commentary that she would say, so that it was kind of an open secret by then. So she had kind of embraced the old generation strategy, and then she went to the newer generation.
Right.
Yeah.
There's some quotes here that speak to this that you have from Elsa Goodlow.
Oh, yeah.
Which I really liked.
Yeah, she was funny.
So she is not really an activist. How would you characterize her?
Yeah, I mean, she's
like an
older lesbian writer who probably wouldn't want me to call her a lesbian writer. So I think she was an elderly woman by the 70s and 80s.
Okay.
Yeah.
So some of her quotes, in one, she's making fun of the coming out scene.
Yeah.
And saying, quote, "Have you understood that my love and friendship for the woman I lived with included sex?"
Right, yeah.
Another quote, "We are not responsible for the fantasies of others. All we can do is not contribute to them."
Yeah.
And another one, which is along the similar lines, where she's decrying sexual voyeurism by saying, "Who has ordained, and on what authority, that we must supply the world with script and justification for our intimate interactions?"
Yeah.
That's an interesting quote to me, because recently there have been people who have followed that same Ellen model, who have sort of claimed, yes, I'm out, but I'm not going to make this grand proclamation, that they have received some backlash from the gay community for saying, well, it's your responsibility, again, because of the social issues that are going on, to be more upfront about this. Whereas, personally, I would sort of more fall in line with this sort of stuff, and like Trudeau's notions of stay out of the bedroom, like the government out of the bedroom.
Yep.
So I'm within that context, I'm wondering, what has the reaction of the gay community then been to this book?
I don't really know that. I mean, I have tried not to read reviews very much, but then I kind of had to, because I had to apply for tenure, and I didn't want to put the bad ones in my tenure file, so I had to cherry pick that a little bit. I think that's what people are meant to do. So I read a few things, and I did notice that people writing from more of a queer theory perspective, I would say, or maybe from a gay and lesbian history perspective, were more critical than people who weren't writing from that perspective, people who were just writing from, say, a cultural history perspective, or just plain old American history, or things like that. So I did notice a little difference there. And I think what the criticism, part of the criticism seemed to be, like, some of them just don't agree with the methodology. They thought it should take a more social history perspective, which is fine. I accept that. Some people felt that I had kind of generalized from these intellectual gays or these artistic gays, and I didn't, find the lives of the subaltern and all this, which is fair. I mean, to be fair to me, I didn't claim to speak for those people, but they do make a fair point. You can't read this and think that people's experience were like this from these intellectuals. But I did notice a criticism of this feeling that this book is kind of inherently homonormative, that it is saying, ultimately we should reconcile, that I stress the theme of reconciliation, even though I don't think I ever used that word, but they feel there's an undercurrent of reconciliation, like, let's get back with our biological families, and then every gay should get married and have their own biological families. And I mean, I guess I can see that. I mean, to be fair, my editor did ask me to say something about gay marriage in the United States in the conclusion. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I don't really like it when historical books try and give you that kind of obvious hook.
Right.
Like, now let's talk about where we are now and how, like, if anything, what I would want to talk about is our culture of revelation. Like, if he had said, maybe talk about Facebook in your conclusion, then maybe I would go with that or something. But gay marriage, I mean, it's about gays and their parents. It's not about that. And I didn't want to make it seem like we were heading in this linear direction, that, okay, now people have reconciled because they had PFLAG and that tragedy of AIDS, but, oh, it's great because we got back together again. And now everyone come out and get married. Wow. I didn't want it to be like that. So I tried to resist that. I mean, there's also kind of pressure to make it interesting for non-gay people or non-bisexual or whatever. Kinsey's 100% heterosexuals. Like, let's try and make it interesting for them. But it's a book about the dynamic between heterosexuals and homosexuals. And I mean, also, I think the other criticism of me was that I didn't acknowledge sexual fluidity very much, that the gays are pure gay and that the straights are pure straights in this book, and they kind of don't go in and out of those sexual orientations, which again is fair. I mean, I just tried to go with how people self-identified, and I mean, a number of those lesbians became straight people later, but at that time they identified themselves as lesbians, and I'm sure a few of the men were also bisexual. But yeah, so I think they felt that I was trying to stress alienation between the two when we could all be anything at any time. We're all a bit boy, we're all a bit girl, we're all queer, all this kind of stuff. So I accept that.
But isn't the idea, I find the idea of homonormative rather interesting, because don't we live now in 2013 in a period where, just in general, not specific to sexual orientation, where everyone lives their own normal?
Yeah, I guess.
Like that is there a normal, like I had this argument with some folks at Blues Fest.
Okay.
And it was talking about just culture, and my contention that mainstream doesn't exist anymore. That there's so many outlets and you can go find what you want, that mainstream is a term that hasn't existed for 15 years. Or it's a thing that hasn't existed in that time. So at the same point, are we not at a situation where normal isn't a thing? Like everyone is doing their own thing, and what is normal to me is my normal, and what's normal to someone else is their normal. And, no better, no worse, just different. And we have our own normals. And are we at that point where that can exist? So this criticism of being homonormative, like that's to me, that's a non-issue.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that's interesting to compare it to music culture. Because don't people always say, like, oh my God, alternative has become the mainstream? Right. And I think maybe that's part of queer activists' worry, is that gayness or queerness or whatever is now going to become part of the mainstream, that there'll be nothing unique or different about this. It's just getting co-opted. But it's still that theme of co-optation, I think, is. But
that's what I don't understand, because sexual orientation, all we ever hear, and more research projects are done on this, that you have as little control over your sexual orientation as you do over your skin color, or your hair color, or your height, or whatever. But
I think queer theorists would disagree with that.
Okay.
They would say we could all be anything and might strike at any time. No, they wouldn't say strike. No, but it could happen at any moment.
Because like the show The New Normal, the fact that they used the word normal.
What's that one now?
That was where it was a gay couple. Oh, it's by
the Glee guy, and it's got a gay.
It's a gay couple that I don't know if it's a surrogate or they just adopt the kid or whatever it is, but it's a gay family.
Okay.
Basically a nuclear family with two men. And they use the word normal in that title, which I thought was interesting. And it spoke to this thing of like, that's normal. What's weird about that? I don't think it's strange. It's just two men who have a family. Like, okay. And that doesn't strike me as being outlandish or ridiculous. I mean, it's something that happens every day, that there's families with two men. And why would... Okay, so that's the normal in that situation for them, and that may not be my normal, but it's a normal for them, and so what? So that's sort of, again, coming back to this idea of the private and public, of this thing that I can't seem to resolve in my own head.
Did I help you a little bit?
A little bit. So the book. So as I look up, we've been talking for over an hour, and I feel like we've skimmed over a lot of issues. This is just—it's really interesting, and something that obviously we haven't gotten to the bottom of, and something that continues to evolve as we move forward. So, but helping us along that route, Not in This Family: Gays and the Meaning of Kinship in Post-War North America. Pick it up. It won the 2011 Lawrence Levine Award of the Organization of American Historians. So for as much as you talked about people who have criticized you in this podcast,
it's just more interesting to talk about the critics.
Okay, all right.
You got to defend yourself.
Heather Murray from the University of Ottawa, thank you for doing this.
Thank you. That was fun.
If you have any questions, comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Check out ActiveHistory.ca for more features and articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.